So hello and welcome again to this workshop, Post-Socialist Britain, Memory, Migration and Political Identity amongst Polish, German and Ukrainian immigrants in the UK. So my name is Sarah Jones and I'm a principal investigator for the project. I'm based here at the University of Birmingham. And so what we're going to do today in this first hour is to give you a brief overview of what our project is and what we've been researching for the last 23 months, I think now, and also then some of our initial thoughts and findings from the data, and then also what we are planning to do in terms of outputs, which is also where we'd really like your input and feedback, which is in the second half of the session where we'll have breakout rooms in order to discuss some of those outputs. Okay, so the project is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and is being delivered by myself and my colleagues at the University of Birmingham and Nottingham Trent University. And I'll introduce you to them, or rather let them introduce themselves in a moment as they present the research findings from the different parts of our project. We officially began in February 2020. So this is a funding application that we submitted in February, sorry, we began in February 2021, but we submitted the funding application in February 2020. You can imagine how much changed in between submitting that application and starting the project. We've now completed the majority of the primary research. What's left are some interviews for the Ukrainian strand, which was a late addition to our project. And also we have one more series of photography workshops taking place in Hyson Green, which are actually starting tomorrow. And they will run until mid-February. So more on those things in a moment. So as I said, our aim for this afternoon is to present our initial findings and get feedback on them, and also present our plans for our outputs and get feedback on those as well. So we're really interested in your ideas about how we can make our research useful for and usable by different groups, so academics, professionals, community organisations, policymakers, schools and individuals. So the project subtitle indicates a particular focus, a focus on Germany, Poland, and more recently Ukraine. But I'd like to stress that we hope our project and its findings will also be much more broadly interesting in terms of how we understand UK society and the role of migration in it. So you're all extremely welcome, and we're looking forward to your feedback. Okay, so in terms of our research questions then, turning first to those. So it's generally assumed in memory studies, which is one of the disciplines, perhaps the major discipline in which we locate ourselves, that there is a link between personal, familial and cultural memories of the past and present political identity and behaviour. Indeed, it seems quite clear that the past plays an important role in how we think about ourselves and our environment in the present, and also how we relate to concepts such as nationality and ethnicity. However, work to date has tended to explore this phenomenon within the boundaries of the nation state. That it's looked at Germans in Germany, Poles in Poland, and Ukrainians in Ukraine, for example. So that leads us then to our primary research question, which is what happens to the link between memory and political identity in the process of migration. So we'd argue that Polish, German and Ukrainian migrants bring their collective cultural and individual memories with them when they move to the UK. And yet those memories are then expressed in a different sociocultural and political environment. So their memories are connected to their country of origin and sustained by ongoing links to those communities. However, they are also influenced by new experiences in the country to which they've moved. So that overarching research question can then be divided into 4 further areas of inquiry. What can the study of memory and migration tell us about how the past impacts on the formation of political identities? How is memory interlinked with other factors in this process? So things like constructions of ethnicity, sociocultural status, and so on. What factors determine if and how memory contributes to support for or rejection of xenophobic and or extremist politics amongst immigrant communities? And finally, what can an exploration of memory and migration contribute to our understanding of how memory is created and transformed in relationships with others? So we examine the intertwining of memory, representation, inclusion, and political identity within 3 immigrant groups living in Britain, each of which is clearly quite distinct and has quite distinct memory politics and migration trajectories. So that's the kind of starting point for us in terms of our research questions. Now, you might well ask what that actually has to do with post-socialism, and also how Britain can be thought of as post-socialist, which is given in the title of our project. So many of you may have noticed the question mark at the end in the title of our project. So it's Post-Socialist Britain ? This is to make clear, I think, firstly, that we're interrogating the concept of post-socialism itself. Is it still relevant? And if so, for whom? So for some scholars, post-socialism is defined by that initial period of transition from authoritarian socialism to democratic capitalism, particularly neoliberal democratic capitalism. And for that reason, the term is sometimes rejected as no longer relevant or even offensive in its suggestion that Central and Eastern Europe is somehow forever becoming. And we're explicitly not using it in that way, and I'll make that clear. So for us then, for scholars of memory studies, the past is never really quite past. And the experiences of socialism and post-socialist transition do continue to echo in the identities of those from the region. Including the million or so who've migrated to the UK, particularly since the expansion of the European Union in 2004. We argue that Britain is made up of the people who live here, and that includes a large minority of people with post-socialist experiences. And the exclusion of their memories and heritage as part of the very fabric of British culture and society risks making those communities invisible, which can in turn contribute to existing processes of marginalization based on constructions of race, ethnicity, class, and socioeconomic status. Indeed, since the 2016 referendum on Britain's membership of the EU, immigrants from member states have faced uncertainty regarding their future, and there's been a reported increase in hate crimes and playground bullying targeted at immigrants from post-socialist countries in particular. So Central and Eastern European migrants have also had quite a particular difficulty in negotiating the UK's hostile, increasingly hostile border regime. However, I'd say we also mean something else or something more by post-socialism than that continued impact of socialism on individual identities and national politics. So we also want to think about post-socialist in the sense of a global post-socialist condition. Sherry and Verdery note that post-socialism, the concept, can engender a critical standpoint. They argue for us to think between the posts, by which they mean primarily between the post-socialist and the post-colonial. And they note that just as post-coloniality had become a critical perspective on the present, post-socialism could become a similarly critical standpoint on the continuing social and spatial effects of Cold War power and knowledge. And an important part of that power and knowledge is bound up with what's known as three worlds ideology, which locates post-socialism, the European East, in the second world, and post-colonialism, the global South, in the third world. And such a perspective largely ignores the ways in which the history of these spaces are intertwined and mutually constitutive of each other, and also of and with the West, which was known as the First World. So East, West, North, and South have never really been separated, or never been separated in this way. So in this context, several scholars have called for a dialogue between the posts. Migration to a super diverse UK is one site where such a dialogue can be captured. Dima Kanef argues that migration provides one means for the designations of post-socialism to be spatially extended. And in the UK, migration also brings together the memories of and lived experiences of post-socialism with those of post-colonialism. Migration to the UK has been dominated in the 20th and 21st centuries by movement of people from Britain's former colonies. And the new wave of migrants following the collapse of state socialism, although they don't have that post-colonial relationship with the UK, they do enter into a context in which most of the discourse, policy, and public understanding of migration and multiculturalism has been marked by it. And that's where I think we want to come in with thinking if Britain can also be thought of as post-socialist, or perhaps in Sherry and Verdery's terms, as post-Cold War. So to do justice to this complex topic, we deploy an innovative interdisciplinary approach with methodologies drawn from across disciplines to answer the research questions from different methodologies, disciplines, and viewpoints. And it's divided into 4 methods-based strands. Firstly, narratives delivered by myself, Maren Roa and Pavel Duba and Natalia Kolgut. Networks delivered by Jenny Wustenberg and Pavel Duba. Media delivered by Charlotte Galpin, Maren Roa and Natalia Kolgut. And communities delivered by myself with Oksana Biskin. So my colleagues are now going to explain what they've found out so far in each strand, and then I'm going to outline the dissemination plan and ways to get more involved. So we're going to start with the narrative strand, which focuses on one-to-one interviews with German, Polish, and Ukrainian migrants, which attempt to draw out if and how interviewees make connections between personal and collective memories, experiences in migration, and their contemporary political attitudes. Now, there are considerable differences, of course, between the experiences of these 3 groups, which also make generalizations quite difficult. So what we're going to do is present the 3 case studies separately, starting with the German one introduced by Maren Roa. So I'm going to hand straight over to her. Thank you, Maren.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I've done the interviews with German participants. I have to apologize in advance because this is a very short presentation, so I will generalize and not reflect the experience and impressions of all the participants that I've interviewed. But there are some general points to make. So first of all, I would see German migrants in the UK as a largely invisible and privileged group. This means that even though there are, in fact, a lot of German-born people in the UK, interview participants typically did not feel there was a strong German presence here and did not feel part of a German community. And because Germans are also not typically constructed as migrants in the British discourse, it is possible for them to choose whether they identify as migrants or not. And that leads to some rejecting the category, arguing that they've never seen themselves as migrants, whereas others feel that they need to remind Brits that they are migrants, especially after Brexit, which for many made them aware of the problems associated with the migrant status. Along with this privileged status, experiences of discrimination among Germans are rare, but there are experiences of othering, which are typically focused on the past. In particular, many participants have had Nazi jokes made at them, and they feel uncomfortable with the British way of dealing with history. And that concerns not only the jokes about such a dark period of the past, but also the celebration of British victories in the 2 world wars, and the way of dealing with British colonialism, which many participants see as not critical enough. German participants point to the German way of remembering Nazi crimes and learning from the past as a better way of dealing with dark chapters of one's past. However, while many participants compare British colonialism and German Nazism, few discuss German colonialism, which indicates that the encounter with the discussion of British colonialism has not led to a reflection on the same period in the German past. And regarding the socialist and post-socialist period, Western German participants often express that they don't know much about it, pointing out that they had no family in East Germany. So this history is perceived as particular only to East Germans and not something to be remembered in all German memory. West German participants also often thought that East-West divisions had been overcome and did not play a role anymore. While for East German participants, the differences and the experience of not being treated equally by the West remain important, indicating a persistent difference in memory cultures between East and West Germans, even in migration. Neither West nor East German participants had the impression that the German division and the socialist period played a part in the British perception of German history, which is super focused on the Nazi period. Now, when asked whether their historical memories influenced their political positions, many participants pointed to the rejection of the far right, in particular to the rise of the AfD in Germany, which needs to be rejected as an important lesson from the past. East German participants discussed the rise of the AfD in somewhat more nuanced terms, seeing it as a reaction to the frustrations of the post-socialist period and the West German othering of East Germans. But they were always keen to distance themselves from this kind of thinking. And then finally, there's a common theme in the interviews, which is frustration with British politics, in particular with Brexit, which is often discussed with reference to the celebratory British way of dealing with their own history, leading to this misguided belief that Britain should be a superpower going it alone. However, there are also other points of frustration, for example, the confrontational two-party system, which is often perceived as less democratic than the German system, and similarly, the quality of the British media, in particular when it comes to reporting on other countries, including Germany. So overall, there appears to be a sense that Germany is doing better in many ways in terms of dealing with its past, as well as in terms of its politics, than the UK. And while many feel at home in the UK, they still see themselves primarily as Germans and do not see a need to become British in order to be settled here. So that's the German case study, and I will now hand over to Paweł, who will talk about the Polish case study.
All right, thank you. Thank you. I will just tell a few words about Polish migrants in the UK, and this is a completely different perspective than the German one, of course, because this is a completely different group of people with a different history and so on. So until now, we conducted 18 interviews with Polish participants, and some preliminary findings that we can mention here is that it's not really surprising that mostly economic reasons for leaving Poland, and so people move to the UK mostly for economic reasons. So this is not very surprising, but this topic is the most common during our interviews. So people mostly choose this. For people, mostly these economic reasons were important. Sometimes they mention also that for them they were a little bit interested in to find something to be somewhere else, to learn English, and to move to the other country. This is also important. There are also some personal reasons. People, for example, who married a British partner, but these economic reasons are the most important still, and sometimes it's combined with other reasons as well. So for another point, yes, we can tell that this link between memory and political identity is quite strong, at least what people say to us. So we can by now we can really say that this link between people's memory, sometimes it's personal, but mostly this is something which we call collective memory, because we talk with people who mostly they don't remember the times before 89, but there's still for them this history and this memory is still important, and according to our interviews, this memory shapes their political identity in such a way or another. And this political identity also evolves during the process of migration. This is also something that we can say, so that a lot of people told us that this political identity changed during the process of migration, and then when they recall themselves years ago, they were different, and this political identity was different than it is now. And what's interesting also in our interviews is that that Polish migrants looks with interest of how British do or don't deal with their past. And but also some people say, and this is quite common topic as well for people who are interested in it, so that for them British don't have they have less history. I mean that historical topics and historical problems and problems with memory and so on are less visible and less important for British. And this is the impression of our Polish of many of our Polish interviewees. What's quite surprising in our interviews, it's really surprising that the Brexit is not a turning point for them. So this Brexit is mentioned by, if I remember well, I think 2 or 3 persons mentioned Brexit for 18 interviews. So this Brexit, which is so important, for example, for German migrants, isn't really a turning point. It's really something which is remembered by our interviewees and something that they like to refer to. And what's also important, quite common, that a lot of people, as we say, other themselves and emphasize their exceptionality compared to their compatriots. For example, some people say, for example, yes, I'm very tolerant and so, but my compatriots, they are not, and I'm different than my compatriots, I'm different than other Poles. Yes, we can hear some voices like that, and some people really like to emphasize their exceptionality comparing to their compatriots. So this is more or less what's most interesting for now in these interviews. So now let's talk. I give the word to Natalia.
My name is Natalia Kokut. I made at the moment just 8 interviews. I will focus more on more practical things than so much scientific, because most Ukrainians, they were fleeing the war from Ukraine, not just because they were poor life, but because they were really fleeing the war. And sometimes they are complaining about not understanding of British people about difference between Russia and Ukraine. And also they brought some kind of culture, everyday and historical experience. And that's why we can make some kind of negative aspects and positive aspects about the expectations about reality in the UK, living in the UK, because most people, they arrived and British thought there must be poor, uneducated people, and mainly it was the opposite situation. And most people who arrived from Ukraine, they were quite highly educated, and they were even sometimes absolutely not poor, and their difference in expectations and reality sometimes happened. From positive moments, the best advantages of Great Britain that compared to Ukraine, as Ukrainians are saying, that's first of all about salaries, the high level of salaries, the presence of system of benefits, which in principle doesn't exist in Ukraine at all. And the sphere of online services and online application that is much better and absolutely developed completely and affordably. Also from positive aspects of life in the UK, also free medicine, even too long to wait for it. But still there will be also negative aspects about medicine. And about disadvantages and negative aspects, that's poor access to medicine and low quality of medical services compared to Ukraine. All Ukrainians are complaining very much about medicine. Also difficulties in placing children into kindergarten, schools, poor quality of education, problems with diplomas recognition, finding job or specialties. Sometimes even problem is finding any kind of job without knowledge of English and reference from UK-based previous job, problems with housing, The problems with housing is one of the biggest for now. Great challenges renting houses by Ukrainian refugees after finishing these 6 months of a year period of them being in host accommodations, because they can host themselves can decide whether it will be half year or in full year. Also, Ukrainian refugees were faced with understanding them as residents of some kind of third world countries. Not all Britons understand difference between Ukrainians and Russians. Most Britons know very little about Ukraine and its culture and level of development. And that's why one of the biggest drawbacks for financial support of Ukrainian migrants was complete unaware by decision makers of Ukrainian culture, level of life and education of Ukrainians. That's why the goal of funding for helping with registering of GP, opening bank accounts, making online visa benefits applications was completely useless and too late. Because Ukrainian refugees made it all by themselves. That's why millions of pounds were mostly spent for the salary of support workers without real support being provided, rather than spend them, for example, these funds for housing needs for Ukrainian refugees. Also, Ukrainian refugees are suffering from understanding them as uneducated and low-skilled. From the narrative interview, they might have expected an uneducated poor woman to come. We are not treated very well because we are perceived as uneducated people from some third world country. Almost all Ukrainians are complaining for the medicine, bureaucracy, and economy. Everything is too slow, not only in decision making, but also in medicine. And also there is the quote about a woman that lost her baby on 6 months of pregnancy. And she was waiting in general queue for 9 hours. It was absolutely urgent case, and she didn't really had a help in time help, medical. Also about economy, lots of people are complaining. It's like, for example, it is already cold enough outside, but the heating does not turn on. Economy, this is like a red thread for today. Especially offensive to Ukrainians is the exclusively economic approach of many British citizens to war issues. For example, they are worried about the increasing gas prices, and when they are told about tortured and killed children in Ukraine. On the other hand, many Britons opened their own homes to shelter Ukrainian refugees. From narrative interviews, we were accepted into houses to live with Britons, which was not the case with any other refugees. But the burden of housing providing was put by government to the individuals. British hosts and relationships are often broke that led to homelessness of lots of Ukrainian refugees. That was the biggest problem, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. So we're now going to move on to the network strand, and I'm going to hand over to Pavel or Jenny, who will be speaking first.
I believe I'm going first.
Okay, Jenny. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you. Yeah, so we've divided it up a little bit, and it turns out to be good because it's quite loud. There's some building work outside, so I hope it doesn't start up again right now. So I'm just going to briefly tell you what we've been doing. We have been interviewing basically organizations that we think underpin how the past is talked about with respect to Germans and Poles, and now we've also added a Ukrainian element to this. So Natalia's now beginning to conduct interviews with Ukrainian organizations or organizations that target Ukrainian immigrants. And so basically we're interested here, you know, unlike the narrative strand, we're trying to figure out how these organizations engage with talking about the past, whether there's a strategy behind their policy or their mission to sort of shape how the past, the German, Polish, or Ukrainian past is seen within the UK. For different audiences, right? Both migrants, but also the British public. And so we've done some interviews, 7 German ones with German organizations, 12 with Polish organizations, and we're still doing the Ukrainian ones. I just want to mention that initially we had also planned to use a particular software to conduct a network analysis of these organizations to sort of figure out how they're connected with each other and with partners. And we kind of had to pivot away from the plan that we had. So I just want to mention that if anyone is interested, I can talk more about it later. But we're now exploring doing more in terms of the analysis of their social media outreach, sort of these organizations that we're already talking to, and that will happen next year. So we're still in the process. So these findings that Pavel is going to talk about aren't, they're not complete, they're preliminary, but I think there are some quite interesting patterns that we can already mention. So over to you, Pavel.
Thank you. All right. So first thoughts, findings, conclusions. So first of all, we've got some different models of politics of memory conducted in the UK by Polish and German institutions, and what I mean by this different model of politics of memory. So, well, we've got a really plethora of bigger and smaller, often bottom-up, this is important, often bottom-up Polish organizations engaged in this promotion of various topics, mostly historical topics related to memory, the memory of Polish soldiers fighting during the Second World War, about British-Polish cooperation during the Second World War, Polish pilots, mostly. This is very common, very popular topic right now, and this bottom-up character of this organization is very important because we've got, of course, very old organization which were created by this first Polish immigration after the Second World War, and this organization still exists. As I said, sometimes there are flag institutions like Institute of Władysław Sikorski or Institute of Józef Piłsudski in London, but we've got also, as I said, many of these bottom-up institutions created by this emigration after 2004. Sometimes people who are gathered around the Facebook website, or they organize something in their neighborhood or so on. There are a lot of this kind of organizations in the UK, Polish organizations, and Polish, of course, Polish embassy can base it's beneficial for Polish politics of memory because Polish embassy can of course use these organizations, and this is a lot of contact between these organizations and Polish embassy, and this is very complicated and very fascinating network of organizations. But what is important also that a lot of these organizations, most of all the organizations which were created by this first wave of Polish immigration after the Second World War, they tried to address their mostly to the other Polish migrants. And now we can see that people try to go beyond this Polish circle and try to address this memory or historical topics to British audience as well. Just try to attract the interest of British audience. I think this is quite important. This is and that we see it. Sometimes it's like people just declare that they'd like to reach this British audience, but they at least they try to do it, and they try to find the measures how to do it. And as I said before, the British embassy in London can draw on this wide-reaching network and can conduct Polish historical diplomacy in the UK thanks to the support of these organizations, of the old organizations, but also these new organizations. So this is really fascinating. And from the other side, I mean, from the German side, you've got this mixture of top-down and bottom-up German organization, with German embassy playing a brokerage role also. And this network of German institutions are, and this is also important, this network is less extensive and it's not explicitly aimed at historical diplomacy. So as we've got a lot of Polish institutions who are created mostly to address these historical topics and to really talk about this historical topic, to promote the historical topics. This is not the case in German. This is not the German case. Which is quite logical if we compare British and German history and the role of Poles and Germans in the Second World War. Of course, this is quite logical. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we're going to move on to the media strand. Charlotte, is you up first?
Yeah, I'm going to start and then I'll hand over to Marin. So thanks, Sarah. So we are dealing with or kind of addressing these three primary research questions in the media strand. So we're interested in how Polish and German migrants are represented in UK newspapers, and then what histories of Poland and Germany are narrated in the UK press. And then through these representations and stories, how British and English identities and collective memories emerge. Next slide. So firstly, when we look at the representation of Polish migrants, we kind of confirm findings of a range of studies on representation of Poles in Britain, in that there is less kind of treatment of Polish migrants as individuals and more kind of a construction of a mass or a flood or influx of low-skilled manual workers, people who are working class, doing those kind of traditional jobs, the idea of the Polish plumber and Polish builder. And particularly after the Brexit referendum, this turned into concern about what would happen if this large number of Poles go back to Poland in terms of fulfilling these labour needs. There's also a kind of idea of representation of Polish as unable to integrate, as having poor language skills, also as a kind of ethnic minority. So we have this kind of constructions or representations of or descriptions of Polish communities that are seen as kind of little Poland, or kind of unintegrated parts of cities that sit alongside communities of other migrants, particularly Muslim populations. So there's a racialization there going on, also in terms of English skills and the impact that might be having on public sector, on schools and things like that. On the other hand, you have kind of more supportive representations of Polish migrants, particularly after the referendum in the left liberal press, where there's a kind of shock about hate crimes being perpetrated against Polish migrants, particularly after the referendum. But what we see is that this often turns Polish people into objects of pity and not really accorded agency in these stories. So they're often talked about rather than talked to. And through this, you get this idea of British people as heroes coming to save or defend Polish victims. And the shock and kind of horror at this kind of hate crime constructs Britain as a fundamentally tolerant place. Next slide. When we look at the representation of German migrants, this is very different. So largely, Germans do not feature as a kind of key subject of news articles, more so within broader articles about EU migration before and after the referendum. Generally speaking, they are seen as, they're kind of represented as white middle-class individuals who are easily assimilated, and you have some key Germans who feature in this, particularly Gisela Stewart, who was a Labour MP who was born in Germany, and also Kerstin Farage, who was the German-born wife of Nigel Farage, who are kind of described as having been in Britain for a long time and obviously well settled and integrated. You also have a lot of coverage of a statement that Nigel Farage made in 2014, where he compared Romanians and Romanian and Germans, and how he would prefer to have a German neighbour over a Romanian neighbour because you know the difference. Essentially, we find in comparison to the Polish migrants, Germans are talked to rather than talked about, particularly with regards to their views on Brexit, but you still have a construction of Germans as a benefit to the British economy rather than any kind of broader value. Then we found two sets of articles which were particularly interesting for us. As I said, Germans were generally not the focus of a lot of articles, but with these two exceptions. The first was a story that appeared in different iterations in the right-wing press, was a story of an Essex girl who had been born in Germany to a British soldier father, but had grown up in the UK. And now was married to a British man, and had recently found out that she was not legally British and couldn't get a passport. And the journalists are describing this as a kind of ludicrous, ridiculous situation. How could this girl possibly not be considered British or English? And this kind of reveals the way in which Britishness is determined if you fulfill certain racial, class and gender roles. And we found that her relation to British men, and particularly the military, was particularly interesting. And then secondly, there was a story that appeared quite a lot about a German NHS doctor who had killed a patient through negligence, who is described as a Nigerian-born German citizen. So here we have an example of a German person of colour, migrant of colour, being the negligent, dangerous migrant. And there was a lot of criticism of Germany for facilitating his right to practice medicine, and then also right to come to the UK. So Maren will now talk a little bit about the construction of German history and German Polish history.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, our second search focused on the portrayal of German and Polish history in British media, and we concentrate in our analysis on articles which put history in some kind of relation with present-day politics. With regard to the representation of both German and Polish history, the overwhelming focus is on the World War II period. In Germany, this includes many articles which discuss the AfD and other far-right movements as neo-Nazis, so they create an impression that there's some form of continuity with or revival of the Nazi period. And many articles also create the impression that Germans are not taking the Nazi past seriously enough, again, often with reference to the AfD, but also topics such as Holocaust denial. There is, however, also a kind of contrasting strand in the media where Germany is discussed as having a strong memory culture and is fighting fascism because of the past. So there it's portrayed as a kind of partial role model for the UK. And sometimes one gets the impression that there's still a kind of battle being fought in Germany between Nazis and anti-Nazis. And while there's less overall on the socialist and post-socialist period, it does feature in particular in comparisons with contemporary British politics, which is quite interesting. So Brexit is sometimes compared to the fall of the wall as a moment of a nation breaking free, escaping its oppressors, etc. By contrast, German Corbyn's politics are compared to DDR socialism, and he's thereby discredited as wanting to take away the freedom of British citizens, just like the GDR took away the freedom of East Germans. And then finally, the communist regime and the Stasi in particular are compared in the right-wing press to the thought police supposedly imposed by political correctness. And overall, there are slightly different assessments of the fall of the wall and reunification. Generally, the fall of the wall being portrayed as a moment of joy and optimism, but also a number of critical articles about reunification having gone wrong. These connected then again to the rise of the AfD in the East in particular. And both periods of the past are used to explain the German support, firstly for the EU, so freedom of movement, which was restricted in the GDR, and for migration, so immigration from outside Europe, in terms of a sense of a responsibility after the exclusivist racist policies of the Nazis. So these policies are explained as something particular to the German experience, which the UK does not need to embrace because it has a different past in a sense. And then regarding Polish history, can we have the next slide? Thank you. So Polish history is generally discussed less than German history. So Poles are mainly discussed as immigrants, whereas Germans are mainly discussed as Nazis, really. But looking at the articles that do reference Polish history, most of them are about World War II as well. And Poles are typically portrayed as victims of the Nazis and sometimes as the main victims, following a very common narrative in Poland itself, as seeing Poland as a victimized nation. Polish support for Britain during the war is also highlighted in some articles, and a few articles also discuss the sensitivity of the current Polish government to interpretations of World War II history which do not center the Polish victim experience. And this sensitivity of the Polish government is also picked up in comparisons of the current ruling party to the communist regime in its use of history, with it being accused of censoring and rewriting history. But interestingly, such perspectives are mainly brought in by Polish writers. So for example, there's a Gazeta Wyborcza journalist who has an article published in The Guardian, and conversely, there's an article by the Polish ambassador, which is published in The Telegraph. So we see ideological lines mirrored across the countries as well. What is not happening in this case is that Polish historical experience is not compared to British politics in the same way that the German socialist period is. And the few articles that discuss the post-socialist period focus on how the transition caused resentment, which led to populism, and also how it led to East-West migration. Although we find that this connection is rarely made in articles on Polish migrants in the UK, so these are not typically presented as being a kind of being connected to history. Similarly to Germany, though, there are also some arguments put forward that the Poles believe in EU freedom of movement, not only because they profit economically from migration, but also because they experience the travel restrictions under communism. So that's the media strand, and I will hand over to Sarah now, who will present the community.
Great. Thank you very much, Maren. So this is the final strand of our project, which is the community strand. So the aim of the community strand was firstly to integrate community engagement from the start, but also to generate research data, and in particular to find out how individuals give voice to their memories in dialogue with others. So really how memory and migration works on the ground, so to speak. So to achieve this, we designed a method based on the principles of arts-based research. So we drew on the advice and experience of our project partners, Centrala, to kind of try and avoid parachuting into communities and asking them to participate into research into which they had no direct input by using this arts-based method. We did this by kind of creating this forum for engagement with the research and also the co-creation of research data and outputs, which will become a little bit clearer in a moment. So the format that we went for was the form of a Central European Photography Club in West Bromwich near Birmingham and in Hyson Green near Nottingham. We're going to run 40 sessions in total, That's 4 times a series of 10 sessions, and so far we've delivered 30 sessions, 20 in West Bromwich and 10 in Hyson Green. As I said earlier, the next series of 10 is starting tomorrow. So the workshops are led by a photographer and community engagement officer, Oksana Biskin, and by myself as well. So the workshops are open to pretty much anybody, well, no, not pretty much, absolutely anybody who wants to take part. So they're deliberately more inclusive than the Polish, German and Ukrainian focus in other parts of the research. So far we've had participants born in, and I may be missing some, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Italy, India, Bangladesh and Nigeria, alongside participants born with and without born in the UK, both with and without a family history of migration. So the focus of the workshops is on developing the skills of photography, which is very much left up to Oksana. I know very little about photography, or at least how to do it. People take pictures of the local places, buildings and objects that are of importance to them around a theme of the week. So the theme of the week relates to the research. So we have my history, journeys, community, belonging, inclusion, exclusion, and other things like that. And then those photographs form the basis of storytelling and exchange of stories within the group as participants explain and describe the work that they've produced. And then the photographs and the narratives are the research data, and they allow us to see how people create and exchange memories in a community, and how they have those dialogues with each other. And we also produce a photo book for each participant as one way of recognizing the labor that they contribute to the project. So here's just some of the examples of the work produced by our participants in West Bromwich, just to give you a flavour of some of the material produced. Okay. So the research is still ongoing. As I say, we're starting the second series tomorrow, but we do have some initial thoughts from the data that we've collected so far. So firstly, our groups are super diverse in a sense. So they're kind of a microcosm of that super diverse communities of which they're part. So that's a term that captures the changes brought about by, in the words of Stephen Verterbeck, a number of new, small and scattered, multiple origin, transnationally connected, socioeconomically differentiated and legally stratified immigrants. And the participants in these super diverse groups negotiate their identities and their sense of belonging in complex ways, both individually and together. And they draw on their lived experiences and memories to discuss complex issues such as racism, experience of xenophobia, negotiating an identity between their community of origin and their life in the UK, dealing with mismatches between expectations and reality. And what's important for us is that participants negotiate these issues individually, but also as a group, drawing on and building on each other's ideas and contributions. They didn't necessarily agree with each other, but they always disagreed in a convivial way. Within those groups, it's often everyday objects that inspired remembering that's then used to connect to others in the group and connect to different experiences of migration. For example, one participant took a picture of a charity shop and told her own story of charity and giving, and that also then inspired group discussion of the importance and value of charity shops for migrants from both Eastern and Southern Europe in this case, when it came to furnishing their first home in the UK, for example. Another example is a photograph of a discarded takeaway taken by a Polish participant, which provoked a discussion around the taboo of food wastage in different contexts, with parallels being drawn between the experiences of food shortages under communism and the financial struggles experienced by the parents of one British Pakistani participant when they first moved to the UK. So our participants make these connections via the memories that inspire or are sparked by those photographs, and they're not generally confined to the ethnic or national group in which they were created, nor are those contexts discarded entirely. So the participants speak about themselves as Polish, Bulgarian, Italian, or British Pakistani, but in their conversation, they all also highlight what's shared between them. So we thus tentatively like to suggest that these interactions can be understood through the framework of what we're probably calling mnemonic conviviality. So conviviality, we understand this to be the everyday processes of how people live together in mundane or everyday encounters. And our participants actively seek out to create common threads in their quite diverse memories, so that what Gilroy terms the strangeness of strangers might give way to this kind of idea of living with and bridging difference. Okay, so that's where we are with the communities strand. I'm just now going to come on to talk about the outputs that we're planning, which is also where we'd really value your feedback in the next part of the workshop, which is going to be in smaller groups in the breakout rooms. So firstly, we of course have academic outputs. So we have a broad dissemination plan, which includes academic, community engagement, schools resources and policies, but I'll just start with the academic outputs. So I will be working on a book with the title Post-Socialist Britain, Memory, Migration and Conviviality After 1989, in which I plan to draw on the research delivered across the project. There'll also be a series of journal articles authored or co-authored by the project team, and emerging from the 4 distinct strands of the research. And something that's likely to happen much sooner than either of those two is a webinar series in 2023 with the title Post-Socialism, Migration and Memory in Britain and Beyond. The CFP is ready, it is about to be launched, so if that's something you'd be interested in participating in, then do look out for that. Then community engagement. So one of the major things that we are doing is a project exhibition produced by our artist in residence, Paulina Kowalkiewicz, and curated by Centrala Space. So this incorporates work by Paulina and also by workshop participants. And the plan is for that to be in Centrala in autumn 2023, and then in a space in Nottingham to be decided in the winter of 2023. There'll also be engagement events around the exhibition. We're thinking perhaps photo walks, but again, that's to be determined. And we're also planning celebration events in West Bromwich and Hyson Green, focusing on the work of our community strand participants in the spring 2023, so around Easter. And finally, we're planning some creative workshops, similar, but perhaps a variation on the communities workshops with Ukrainian refugees in Birmingham, also in the spring next year. Then we come to the schools resources. So we are in the middle of preparing these. These are going to be resources for teaching about migration to the UK, for example, in supplementary schools, but also in history, German studies, political science, sociology, at GCSE and A levels. So we're thinking about resources for between 14 and 18 years old. So these will combine a series of mini lectures, recorded mini lectures on the broad history of post-socialist migration, combined with some innovative resources to engage students, in particular with our research findings. So the innovative resources are going to be produced in a collaboration with NTU art and design students who are going to be commissioned to work with stories and anecdotes from our research findings to produce, well, whatever they're inspired to produce, but it might be something like graphic storytelling, animation, and so on. And finally, policy and media briefings. So there are 3 planned. The first, improving migrants' representation in the British media. So this is targeted at British journalists and journalism students with the aim of improving, as is in the title, improving the representation of migrants and also of Germany, Poland and Ukraine in the UK press. So it's going to contain an overview of the key findings from the media strand on characterization and stereotyping of Polish and German migrants and portrayal of Polish and German history and British collective memory, and also some of the findings from our interviews regarding the impact on individuals of that media coverage, and also recommendations for how journalists might do better. The second a policy briefing is around community cohesion in super diverse Britain. And this is targeted at local and or national policymakers with the aim of, yes, improving community cohesion by fostering support and networks between different communities, thinking about how different migrant groups relate to each other, where problems arise, what's going well, and what solutions there might be. And thinking about any social or formal institutions that make settling and feeling at home in the UK easier, or by contrast, which pose obstacles. And also thinking about the role of memory and heritage in those contexts. And finally, sustainable support for Ukrainian refugees. Again, the target group for that is local or national policymakers. And the aim is to highlight problems of Ukrainian refugees in Britain, especially regarding housing policy and developing recommendations to address these challenges. So thinking about the current legal situation, the time limit on private hosts, insecurity of what happens afterwards, giving a flavour from our interviews of the hopes and fears of our participants and their experiences, and then also recommendations for thinking about how we might rectify that situation. For example, it could be direct funding to private landlords rather than funding to Ukrainian refugee housing assessments. So these are the outputs. The last three of those outputs are what we'd like to discuss with you really in the breakout rooms, and I'll just explain how that's going to work in a moment. Here, just a little bit more information on how to find out more and get involved. So visit our project website, which is actually pretty up to date at the moment. Follow us on Twitter at SocPost, if that's still a thing that people are doing. Visit our Facebook site, the link's there, or please just get in touch with me as the principal investigator, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or direct you anywhere. So what's going to happen then for the rest of the afternoon? So we have 10 minutes over, but I think that's actually not so bad. We have the introduction to the project, which we've already done. We're now going to move into breakout rooms. So there are 3 breakout rooms: community engagement, schools resources, policy and media briefings. Following the questions which we've outlined in our programme, and one of us will be in each room to chair, so you don't need to have the programme in front of you or remember what those questions are. And that's really where we'd love your input as we're developing and engaging with these resources, with these outputs. So you can choose which breakout room you want to go into. So breakout room 1 will be community engagement, breakout room 2 will be schools resources, and breakout room 3 will be policy and media briefings. We will allow an hour in the breakout rooms, and then we'll come back so at around 4:10 for an open discussion, just drawing those key ideas together. Okay, I'm now going to open the breakout rooms. So team members, you know who you are, make sure you join the right room. And then everyone else, please just join the room that you feel that you could contribute the most to. Thank you very much.